Right, this is not that big a stack. Why am I having so much trouble with this thumbnail? Stop. No, stop moving. I know you can't move unless I touch you, but I feel like you are moving independently of me. Okay. Hi guys. In looking back over my year and my favorites list, I realized that I'd read more books from Central and Eastern Europe than I thought in 2020. And since I know here in the US at least, we learn next to nothing and nothing useful about this region in our education system, and because books from these countries are less commonly discussed even among people who tend to read in translation as English speakers, I figured I'd go through my list and give you a bit of an overview, even if it is just of my own, random selections and in a rapid fire kind of way. I also want to ask those of you who are from these countries for recommendations for any pronunciation correction. That is more than welcome. And just if there are any things that you think would be valuable for English speakers to consider as we approach books from your countries, understanding, of course, that you're all individuals and not representatives of culture. I'm focusing on nonfiction in this video. The next one will be these fiction picks, and I want to start with authors from the region and move on to those from other backgrounds. So of these 7 books I'm going to talk about, 3 made it to my favorites list of 2020, which I'll link below. One favorite is the Czech memoir, How I Came to Know Fish by Pavel. This was translated by Jindriska Badal and Robert McDowell, and it is a deceptively simple, short memoir about the forests, lakes, and rivers of Czechoslovakia and the role they played for the author in a childhood that involved, among other things, World War II and the occupation of Bohemia. And I can't be completely sure about this because I haven't read this in the original Czech, but this strikes me as an excellent translation, one that combines flowing, idiomatic English with a real Czech sensibility that's hard to put your finger on. The other favorite so far was Border, A Journey to the Edge of Europe by Kapka Kassabova. She wrote this in English because she now lives in Scotland, but she was raised in Bulgaria. And this was her returning to the borderlands shared by Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece. It's a combination of travel writing, memoir, journalism, and history. And if you want to talk about a sub-region that isn't discussed much at all, even within Eastern European studies, you're talking about Southeastern Europe. An author who's more famous than the majority on this list is Svetlana Alexievich. Like many people, I only became familiar with her after her 2015 Nobel Prize win. Case in point, this was first published in Russian in 1985, I believe, but the English edition, translated by Richard Pevear and Larissa Volokhonsky, only came out in 2019. This is Last Witnesses, an oral history of the children of World War II. And it's interesting to me, Alexievich is really a Soviet writer, both in her subject matter and her personally. She was born in what's now Ukraine, identifies as Belarusian, and writes in Russian. And Last Witnesses is a series of interviews with people who were children, mostly in Belarus during World War II. It follows her typical style of documentary literature where she takes her own questions out. And so what you get is this almost barrage of uninterrupted memories from each person. And even more so than with her other books, this one is hard to read, both because it's less varied and of course because it's horrific things happening to children. So there was this real numbing effect that came over me, especially as the book progressed. But a book I think is interesting to compare to that one is A Little Annihilation by Anna Janko. This was published in Poland in 2015 and came out in English last year, translated by Philip Boehm through World Editions, who sent me this review copy, and I was very grateful to receive it because this memoir was very close to being a yearly favorite. I think it's special. When Janko's mother was 9, her village in eastern Poland was obliterated by the Germans, and she witnessed the murders of family members, including both parents, before fleeing with her even younger siblings in tow. Janko recounts the details of that day, but she's also interested in the long-term effect on her mother, on the country as a whole, to have suffered this level of devastation repeatedly in such a short period of time. So much so that this is one of many overlooked stories of its kind. And she then turns her gaze to second-generational trauma, the trauma that she carries, maybe biologically, but definitely psychologically, from being the child of someone who experienced this. And it ends up being a really complex reflection on different types of inheritance and the ways that people do and don't process an event of this magnitude. Janko addresses large sections of the book to her mother, and her writing is clean and elegant, even with a sort of clear-eyed poetry to a lot of the passages in here. So if you're interested in childhood war trauma, I would honestly recommend this one over the Alexievich, much as I love her. Next is Proud to be a Mammal by Czesław Miłosz, which I discussed in my recent Hall of Shame. This is another Nobel laureate and Polish writer. In this case, these essays were translated by Catherine Leach, Bogdana Carpenter, and Madeline G. Levine, and they purposely chose a wide selection of his 20th century essays. So you get all kinds of reflections on things like his childhood and adolescence in Lithuania, his Catholicism, and in keeping with the apparent theme of this video, his terrible World War II experiences. I am partial to wry intelligence in any kind of writing, and so I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship between Miłosz and me. Finally, 2 books from outside voices. One I've talked about a lot, Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, an American historian. This was another favorite of the year, and it's about the when, how, and why of Stalin and Hitler's regimes murdering 14 million people across Eastern Europe from 1933 to 45. It's best if countries aren't led by sociopaths. So glad we learned that lesson. Great job, everyone. But this also was a good reminder for me that, too often we act like the only readable nonfiction is narrative nonfiction. People say things like, it reads like a novel to try to hook people, which I can understand, but I just want to say that this dense history book was gripping. Gripping, I tell you. And rounding out the nonfiction is Midnight in Chernobyl, the untold story of the world's greatest nuclear disaster by Adam Higginbotham. He's a journalist and a British transplant to the US who was writing this around the time that the Chernobyl show from HBO was being produced separately. And I think the coinciding of the show and this book was a reminder to the English-speaking world that so many of the details of this disaster have only come to light over time. We have so many more puzzle pieces now than we did in Soviet days. So this is a detailed account of what caused the explosion, how the government did and did not react to it, and how individuals and communities were affected in Chernobyl's wake. And Higginbotham especially focuses on the massive cleanup job undertaken by so many different types of Soviet civilians. I gotta say, the protagonists of the HBO show, like Legasov and Sherbina, do not come across nearly as well in here, which is to be expected when they're not being treated as vessels for messages and the audience's empathy. Overall, I really enjoyed this as a first book on Chernobyl, so I can't compare it to any others. There's a reason this event is still such an object of fascination, and it's not just American schadenfreude directed toward the Soviet Union, although I'm sure that does play a factor. I think you can only underestimate the global impact of this nuclear disaster and of the lessons we can draw from it if we're wise enough to draw them, which all things considered we probably aren't. The elephant trundling in the background of this video is the omnipresence of World War II and trauma generally, so I think it's worth pausing on that. It's kind of a mix of different factors, really. I mean, people don't tend to write history books about how awesome things went, or memoirs about how their idyllic childhoods led them to becoming well-adjusted adults. So you can lay some of the grimness overall at the door of nonfiction. But as I say that, I'm thinking about a Chopin biography that I have on my TBR, and that would have fit on this list, but added variety. Although I gotta think that tuberculosis plays a major role in that one. But regardless, we can't just all say this is a nonfiction thing. The World War II question is interesting because it has a rare trifecta in that it was a cataclysmic event for Central and Eastern Europe. It is historical, benefit of some distance, but it also is recent and fresh in many ways in its impact. Something like the 30 Years' War has the first 2 components, but not the third. But I think when it comes to English translation, even given the justifiable significance and prevalence of World War II literature coming out of these countries, publishers from English-speaking countries tend to gravitate toward those narratives that they assume that their readers want and expect from Central and Eastern European writers. It's either World War II or it's how dark and constricted everything was under the pall of communism. Again, worthwhile reading, but other things have happened and are happening in these countries. Also, people are going about their lives. That was one of the funniest things to me about living in Russia, was my friends would ask in these hushed tones, what's it like living there? As though they thought my life was suddenly filled with, I don't know, mink hats and intrigue, when really people were just getting up, going to school or work, buying milk, coming home, fighting with their families, and doing it all again the next day, same as everywhere else. The weather was just colder and the humor was drier. So why do we insist on defining the scope of these countries in terms of regular life and history so narrowly? Why is our perspective on them so narrow? Where is the translated Russian memoir about a dysfunctional mother-daughter relationship where no one's village is burned down? I don't know. I don't have answers to these questions because I only suspect that these are some dynamics going on behind the scenes, and I only see the results in terms of what has been translated, and I never see the original selection that was available. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this topic. Also, let me know what you think about any of the titles that I mentioned, and I'll be back soon for my fiction roundup. Bye, guys. Am I gonna fix my hair? Ow, my wrist. That didn't even fix it. It just made it worse.